the idea of addiction as a social problem, as a problem that is identified in the public sphere, that the government should be doing something about, has been around in the kind of middle-class circles of discussion for at least 30 years. So this is not a new problem, and it's certainly not a new problem that is being discussed in the Iranian press.
Yes, those are very helpful contextual facts and figures. First, I want to say that, especially those who are not closely familiar with the situation of women in Iran, don't leave this event thinking that this is the picture of all Iranian women, or because it's so sad and so hopeless in most of those cases that we don't want to carry that sadness and hopelessness with us. This is a small part of the population who are most vulnerable, most devastated by, of course, social and political factors, I would say. And they are the most neglected part of the society as well, and hidden. One of the hidden aspects of the larger society of Iran. So it gives us the bad news, at least part of the bad news about the situation of women in Iran. But even within that bad news, that this film itself is a good news. That in Iran, such a film is possible to be made by the effort of progressive, caring filmmakers. Lots of efforts, I'm sure, has been spent to make this film possible. And there have been resistance to even screen this film. It was initially screened, as far as I know, in university settings among people like us, university people, scholars, and some ministries, some policymakers have also seen it. But I heard today, I think you were saying, or maybe Nilufar or Amir were saying that this was also publicly screened, which is even better.
Does it need to go through any sort of approval process?
Of course. Every film in Iran goes through screening, approval, censorship, and all that. So the main reason the authorities resist showing such films is that they don't want, first of all, to show that in an Islamic utopia that they had promised, there's so much problems, prostitution, violence, addictions, and all that, so they want to cover it. But also they argue that the more you show these things, it's going to make people desensitized toward the wrongdoings like prostitution, even like teaching about sex and about AIDS. These are taboo still for many conservatives in Iran. So that's why it's a bold and courageous film, and I'm glad that it has been made and we are seeing it.
Can I ask you one question before you go on? It is bold. I can see that. Is it transgressive? Would you consider this a transgressive film there?
To some extent it is, because first of all, it's openly talking, although there has been in the past also sex education to some extent, but openly talking, even hearing the voices of prostitutes, voices of sex workers directly is rather bold and transgressing the norms in Iran. But also, it is, as I say, it tells us a lot of things about the larger picture, the larger political system, the larger cultural attitudes. Even though this film tries to humanize these victims, for the most part they are actually victims rather than criminals. And the film tries to show that, as I'm sure many of you sympathize with them rather than thinking they were criminals, right? So that shows the way the film, the director was intended to show that how the situation, how these women were criminalized in the process of their desperate situations. But also it shows us that, first of all, we don't really have good statistics, at least I don't. If anybody else has, let me know. How many of such places, such shelters exist? I know that this particular place do not keep these women for longer than a month or 21 days. I know many of them. They have to go either back to their families or go to other centers. There are NGO made centers like Khane Khorshid that collaborate with centers like this, as far as I know. But the problem is that, as you could see in the film, this was such a worn out place, right? It was poorly maintained, and it shows that how limited the budgets are that are allocated to, like, Sazmani Behzisti, I don't know how to translate that into English, the welfare organization. The welfare organization has a small budget compared to the huge, incredible budgets allocated to clerical institutions, to propaganda, institutions, to mosques. This is not only me saying. I heard from the head of مؤسسه جرم شناسی, the Institute of Criminology, who was saying that if we allocate only small portion of the endowments, موقوفات, and charity money that collected every year, just a small portion of it to things like this, to shelters like this, we can help many more women and children and street children and street women and all that. But unfortunately, as you could see, even the water pipe had to be fixed by one of these women. Tada was fixing it. So it shows that it's a desperate situation, short-staffed and short temporary refuge for these women. And the same with many schools in Iran that are worn out and, poorly maintained. So, but the very existence of the place also is a good news, right? I mean, I'm trying to see both the achievements, some of the efforts and people in Iran are making in this regard, but also still the problems and the huge problems. The other thing that I think we can learn from this film and reflect on is how we should view these women and how the society should view these women. As I just mentioned, these women are, for the most part, not like harmful, dangerous criminals. These are products of a vicious cycle of poverty, violence, dysfunctional families, addicted parents, abusive parents. Usually, we know that women, again, it also goes back to the gender ideology, the male domination in society that tends to sexualize women, especially younger women. And many of these sexualized young females at very juvenile stage of life are being sexually abused and then resort to escaping the family, fleeing away, and then they go where? To the streets. And then the vicious cycle starts on the streets. The more abuse on the streets, more poverty, and then the negative label. When they have this negative label, it's going to be very hard to obtain jobs, to find any legitimate source of money. Then they resort to prostitution, especially when they get also addicted, mostly by street criminals, people on the street. That they are usually don't let me just go on.
No,
You can interrupt me. Because I can talk for hours about this film.
That's a great segue, because I was particularly struck by the generational drama being played out. And for the most part, these women, except for Mariam, are middle-aged.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, I guess, one of my questions is, how have social attitudes towards women addicts or street women evolved from the time that they were young until now? And also social resources that are being allocated to support them. How have those evolved? And for instance, I'm thinking of the story of the, I think her name was Ladan, the one whose parents were actors. And that's a very sort of, pre-revolutionary, pre-revolutionary sort of narrative of these decadent, westernized, playing Othello and all that, and what has become of her since then. So I was wondering if you guys could comment on that.
I saw Othello in Tehran only a couple of years ago, I should say. They still do Othello in Tehran. The generational issue, I mean, we should point out to those who may not know that, even in the 1990s, documentaries were being made about social problems in Iran. In fact, think about it, the failure of the reformist movement to change politics at the top, a lot of intellectuals direct their attention at society. Many famous intellectuals involved with reformist politics, in fact, were sociologists like myself. I've met many of them, and they went out and documented child labor, or sort of street children, prostitution, drug use, and made it a subject of attention for intellectuals, middle-class Iranians, and of course entering these problems into the public sphere. And then of course politicians had to deal with that, and either they would ignore it, but it became a subject of attention already in the 1990s. So there's been a history, and documentaries were a part of the media that was created to focus attention on these problems. And it wasn't just the reformists that did this. It's also the right wing in Iran. The right wing in Iran, especially the new right, who did Ekhajiha? Denamaki, of course, got famous, infamous. Before Ekhajiha, he made a short documentary about prostitution in Iran, not to give a humane picture of them, but to shame the Islamic public. How could a problem like this exist in society? Nevertheless, on both sides of the debate in Iran, the labeling of these particular processes as social problems, maybe not humanizing them, but certainly them as problems, already entered the sphere a generation ago by now. I mean, certainly in the late 1990s, early 2000s. However, those documentaries and also subjects that were often portrayed in film don't give the mic over to the characters as much as we saw in this film. Letting people tell their stories from beginning to end humanizes their experience, and I did not see. I saw them still able to exercise control over the small parts of their life that they had gathered together. And previous films in this genre, and it really is a genre in Iran, the genre of social problems on film, have not done that to this extent, I would say.
It had more the voice of God narrator, kind of controlling the narrative.
Well, the eye of the narrator, the eye of the film, in my recollection, tended to be, of course, judgmental because it was coming from above, and it was just look how bad things are. But these characters, the individuals in those films, were just general stand-ins for a social problem, as opposed to a human being with a life, who had a past, a history, a mobility up or down, education. Actually, see the humor, the kind of adapt. I mean, these are literate women in many ways. The ways that they're talking about Iranian culture and society,
Was the sort of aspect of queer love or gender dysphoria, was that also, is this something new, or has it already been? That's new ground as far as I can tell, certainly to this extent. Maybe people in the audience can correct us if they can think of other films that have
shown so much up front, the fluidity in masculine and feminine practices. Of course, think about it. I mean, it's not a coincidence that in one of the most marginalized places in society, no one's policing your behavior the same way they would, like, in a middle-class neighborhood, in the middle-class family. It's actually pretty common in lots of societies where the most marginalized peoples are where those type of rules break down. The most marginalized people end up together. Remember the scene where how hard it was for a woman to find an apartment to rent? That's an example.
Tells a lot about the...
It's very difficult for women to live alone, especially in working class neighborhoods.
I thought that was because she had no money. That was also because she was a single
Generally, yes. It's hard to rent, to find a rental home for a single woman. Single mother, a little bit less so, but especially a woman alone. I think some of the films that this film reminds me of are like Zindan Zanan, Women's Prison by Manije Hikmat, right? And also some of the films by Rahshan Bani Etemad touches what's going on underneath of the city. Zir Puste Shahr. Yeah, and this film, although I had some questions, you would know better as an expert in cinematology and all that, about some of the ethical issues. For example, remember that scene, the woman is angry saying that, why are you filming us? What's this purpose of the whole thing? What do you see other than our misery? And she says, everybody exploits us. So, and also I noticed that, I mean, I'm glad that the director included that piece, that objection of that woman, which was so genuine. So, but I also noticed that the cameraman,
right after the scene of camaraderie and singing together, right. And you know.
Yeah. So he didn't want to hide that, which is I appreciate. But also I didn't appreciate the fact that the camera person was male. At one point I didn't know that. I was always asking myself, who is filming? But at a few points, if you remember, when the women were trying to sing or say things that are more intimate or more sexual, they were hesitant because there was a man there, and that was the cameraman. So there are some ethical issues even about this film that one can, discuss.
I mean, and the director was a male, a guy.
Most people involved were men.
Yeah, so that's very interesting to me. We talk about the female gaze and the male gaze.
Yeah. And ultimately the censors at the state level are mostly male.
Right, sure.
But that raises the question precisely that whether the cameraman was male or not, in order for this film even to have gone out, would they have been able to say the things that they wouldn't be saying anyways in front of the cameraman?
I thought there was another extraordinary ethical issue or question. It was fascinating to me as a filmmaker. So when I assume that the first character we meet, I assume she's a trans woman, right? And she goes out and she's...
Mariam? Oh, no.
No, not Mariam. Yeah. The very first one, she's tall, thin, and she goes out and she's street walking, basically, right? And she's wearing a wireless mic, and she gets into a car, and the mic is still going, and we hear this man's voice. I'm so curious what the rules are for releases in Iran, because in America, in theory at least, legally, you're supposed to have a release for that. So I'm sure that man wasn't mic'd.
The apartment building as well, when she went we had the shot from outside the building, and she was, having it out with her relative. Her
yes. So, I mean, sometimes you could say things are, quote, fair use, they're legally, it's incidental, it happened in the course of making the film, you didn't solicit it to happen, but it's for all of us filmmakers here too, we struggle with these issues all the time. I thought that was a fascinating moment.
I also found the case of Mariam fascinating, the way she was treated by everybody else. Her being a queer was not even recognized. I mean, they knew that she was different, but nobody, I mean, the person who managed the shelter kept telling her, "You are a girl, aren't you? Why don't you want to marry and don't you want to become a mother?" And she responded, "I prefer to be a father." And still, this woman doesn't get it, or maybe she gets it, but she doesn't want to acknowledge and recognize her being different, her being not just, heterosexual. But all this shows the sensitivity of the director, that he included all these cases, which are taboo breaking and interesting to reflect on, and also hopefully for this society in Iran that gets exposed to this diversity of sexuality, of attitudes, hopefully will change some of the rigidity of viewing women and viewing also sexual issues.
Perhaps one or two questions and then we should open it up. But I'm just curious what any of you think about why this film was called Femininity. It's a very particular slice of femininity, yeah? Do you guys have opinions? I'm an outsider to the culture, so I'm not sure what else I'm missing in the film.
I personally found a very normative view of femininity reproduced in the film. The view of women as mothers, as caretakers. The one who's closest to having an escape route is the one who is the most maternal figure. What was her name?
The older woman?
The one who was talking with her daughter on the phone, her daughter abroad.
So,
I think so. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Leila? No. Saida?
I wrote down some of them. And even though we get these other forms of, what does it mean to be a woman, the gender dysphoria, the queer femininity, I think the ones that are the most explored, except for maybe the queer couple, maybe the gay couple, and I don't even know if we should call it a gay couple, because that's a Western construct. It's an imposition on a relationship that seemed quite normative, like it seemed quite accepted and not stigmatized in that way, where homosexuality is stigmatized. So it wasn't approached in that way. So I thought that was the one place where there was something that allowed women to go out of the sort of maternal role.
The camera is very non-judgmental.
Yes.
Which is lovely, I think. I mean, we are projecting our ideas and feelings onto it, but I didn't feel there was judgment in the camera, in the filmmaking. Did either of you have any extra thoughts? And then we should open it up to the audience, I think. But in terms of why should we just open it up? Okay,
also,
all right.
Secret cameras in the ceiling. You remember some of these overhead shots? I mean, how do you cut multiple times in a scene? So because there's a camera, like an iPhone or something, sitting up, a Samsung, sitting up way up top on the balcony, shooting down into them, eating breakfast, eating dinner, washing clothes, and then it cuts to a close-up, right? So it's sophisticated documentary filmmaking in that sense, because it gives a sense of verite, of realism, but highly constructed, I would say, including all of the backstage conversations that we're all of a sudden privy to. But, it won an award at a documentary film festival, or just, it seems like, okay.
I think, it's beautifully shot, well edited.
There's more going on in the film, I just want to say, there's more going on than even we realized. It won an award. There's some kind of, it's a sophisticated film.
I think these observational films, there were interviews, but it was very observational also. And the hardest part about making a film like that is just getting the people's trust, to open up. And they did all open up. And they know that they're going to be stigmatized further by opening up their stories.
I do doubt that everybody signed a release, though. I don't think you could make a film like that here, for legal reasons. Let's give the director the benefit of the doubt. If he was here, I would ask him. Did you ask permission of people after they complain about being filmed? Did they relent and say, okay, include it?
Well, you know, I have
John's
found, as a documentary filmmaker, and then we'll open it up to the audience, but I have found that most people want to tell their stories. Most people have a story to tell, and if they are treated with dignity, no matter what station of life they're living in, and you know how much hardship or how far they've fallen, everyone has a story to tell, and people feel honored. You know, there's a famous documentary textbook, and we call it interviewing and editing. We call it midwifing people into eloquence. We're helping to create these portraits, to give them their eloquence, to restore their eloquence in a way.
Chance to be seen and heard, right?
Yes, as you said, to humanize people. But are there comments, questions? Yes.
Do you know if the addiction rate is it higher for men in Iran than women, or is it about the same?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I would imagine. Well, it's hard to generalize, so I'm not sure. I'm going to say sociologists say they don't know and they don't know. Nevertheless, you know, addiction, like in any cultures, is a cultural trope. Not heroin, of course, but opium addiction in Iran is. I always compare it to the equivalent of alcohol addiction for white working class American communities. So, like, everybody has an uncle in Iran who smokes opium, for example. My aunt's husband used to reek
As
of
far as
opium.
I know, it's more than that for men.
It's more for men?
It's more, yeah.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. It's more for among men. Generally, crime rates also is higher among men, but the rate of addiction is increasing among women. It's still below the rates among the male population, but it is increasing, which is itself important to understand why. Generally speaking, women tend to commit less crimes because they have been socialized to think about other people's needs more so than their own needs, and they are more under supervision, closely watched, and they are less engaged in socially risky and the positions that makes people more susceptible to criminal engagement. So, but prostitution, if you call it a bezehkari, as they still call it in many places.
Translation, please.
Like almost like criminal acts, illegal at least, if not criminal. So that is increasing, and with that comes addiction usually, and with addiction comes all sorts of crimes. Because when you want the drug, you are, as she said, many of them, I was willing to do anything to get money, to get drug.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you know of any women directors, producers, or cinematographers in Iran, because for years I've seen just about every Iranian movie, mostly narrative fiction, which are all wonderful. And this is my first time seeing a documentary from Iran, and again, it was all male.
No, we have several outstanding women directors in Iran, and that's why I'm saying, you know, we have to see the larger picture. There are lots of good news about women's achievements in Iran. For example, in the field of education, they are even outperforming men in higher education. 62% of student enrollment, but is female, and many directors are making, as I said, like Tahmin Milani, Rakhshan Bani Etemad, Puran Derakhshande, tell me names, Manije Hekmat, Samira Makhmalbaf, all the family members of the Makhmalbaf are filmmakers. Several, I mean, just Google Iranian filmmakers and directors. You see tens of names, if not hundreds. Some of them are not that famous, but there are like dozens of them who are well respected and internationally acclaimed directors. But Iran's women's situation is very contradictory, very paradoxical. We have, on the one hand, the highly educated women, but not only these women who had hard time to find legitimate employment, ordinary women, highly educated women don't find jobs. The level of unemployment among women is twice as much as among men. The higher their education, the less likely they can find suitable job for their level of training and education. And many other problems. There very low level of representation in decision-making and leadership roles.
Does this sound familiar?
Well, it is worse than many places. I mean, the percentage of women in the parliament, for example, in Iran, is lower than even the standards of Middle Eastern countries, which is already low. The average is 18%, the world average, and in the average in Middle East is 2, and MENA, meaning North Africa, is about 12%, and in Iran it is, after like latest improvement, which before that was 4% of women in the parliament, in Majlis, thanks to women's efforts, they raised it to 8%, which is still very low. Among the elite, the ruling elite, only 3.4%, right? Remember, oh, you were not there. Just a few days ago, we were at a conference in Stanford University, and one of our colleagues, Professor Brujerdi, who has a good profile of the current elites in Iran, showed that only 3%, some of them are women, and in the managerial positions, only 5%. So it is really, and their family law is so incredibly biased toward men and sexist and discriminatory.
I think I understand that it's more acute in Iran. This is a human condition. This is patriarchy, I think, and misogyny, and we're all dealing with it, though, in different ways, in different cultures. Other questions or comments? Yes?
Yeah, so about the welfare politics of this, if I understood you correctly, I think, Kevan, you mentioned that this would be a publicly funded effort, what we saw, so it's kind of run privately but publicly funded. And you mentioned how there's been a turn toward harm reduction as the official policy. Is it that the government funds efforts like these to sort of be at arm's length from them because of the stigmatization of drug addicts and so on? And if I could just throw in a very quick second question, is there, how many people would see this kind of film in Iran? Is it just seen by sort of intellectuals, the avant-garde and so on, or is there a broader culture of documentary?
So I have the same question. Can everybody hear the question, or should I repeat it? Okay, so you're asking, is this a publicly funded organization, but given to private NGOs to keep some kind of distance between the government and the work that's being done? And then an entirely different question, which someone else can handle maybe, which is about what sort of culture is there for documentary watching, filmmaking, watching audiences?
There were multiple hands all in that question. Can we just take all those questions? Because you two had questions too. So yeah, you just go ahead and ask them.
Oh, okay. First of all, I want to say thank you for allowing a space where these voices were heard. That's pretty amazing.
You should thank Nilufar and Amir and the whole student association here.
It's really great to see, because I teach here too, so I'm like, oh my gosh, this film is going to be screened at USC for the first time outside of Iran. That was pretty amazing to be able to have that here. So thank you for that. And one thing I wanted to also address is that, like, Tahmina Milani, as you mentioned, that is a pretty well-known female filmmaker, feminist female filmmaker in Iran, and she was actually in prison because of the films that she has. So it's interesting to think of, the kind of backlash that might come to a male director and filmmaker that can be very varied and be very different from, because her charges were never dropped, but a lot of the filmmakers here, like Martin Scorsese, had backed her up and got her released from prison, but she's still, so I just feel like, what are all the differences and the risks that happen when women do produce films there?
What was the name of there was a male filmmaker who was placed under house arrest, and he ended up making a film about
Jafar Panahi.
in house arrest.
Jafar Panahi.
Yeah.
Panahi.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I wanted to ask about that is, because there's so much risk and this film does focus on women, is there a way to know if this film really gets a lot of screenings and a lot of publicity, that are those women now, and the woman who's running that organization and kind of showing safe sex, that obviously it's out of wedlock sex, it's like women are voicing, oh, you know, I'll do it twice if he puts a condom on, things like that. It makes me worried if like those women are now going to be visible and at risk, kind of at the expense of us being able to appreciate the film.
Right, so how much is the filmmaker endangering the women, right? Which is, you know, just really briefly, then I'd like to hear from you guys. But, you know, here at the Film School of Cinematic Arts at USC, George Lucas is a big patron of our school, and he just endowed a chair in cinematic ethics. And as of a year ago, we've required that all incoming graduate students have to take, the first semester, they take a class in ethics. This is a classic case of ethics and informed consent. How much do these women, how informed are they? Can they give a sense of informed consent? Do they understand the ramifications if this film were to get a lot of distribution? But I think this goes back to this gentleman's question that we haven't answered yet, which is...
I know him. He goes to school with me.
Okay. Okay.
Two women next to him had their hands up first.
But the question is, I have the same question, forgive me, as an American who would love to go to Iran and haven't. And by the way, I went to film school here as an undergrad with a woman from Iran, Yasemin Malik Nasser, who's made some documentaries as an actor and as a director. And she just moved back to Tehran, actually. But I am, so forgive my ignorance, I would like to go to Iran, and Yassi and I have talked about making a film together there, but what is the culture for documentary filmmaking? Because that really, we need to know that to understand if these women would really be at risk.
I wrote a book on the welfare system, not on documentaries, so I'll just get to my expertise. So, I mean, there was an official sign, and you saw it, one shot in the film, the official sign for the organization. So, I mean, it's not a moonlighting organization, it's clearly recognized. I'm not sure who gives the funds. Of course, some of these organizations get funds from private charities. There's many mutual aid societies in Iran, like in a lot of Middle Eastern countries. There's a lot of charity work. You know, middle-class do-gooders go down to South Tehran, work with Afghan kids, work with drug addicts. It happens in Iran as well as other places. Often feminized, too. Highly educated women that are trained in public health, trained in social policy, in University of Tehran, Shahid Beheshti, these places that have pretty high, well-trained professors. And then, you know, what are they going to do with all this, with a skill set? I would like to say, however, that the public health discourse in Iran has, you know, the idea of promoting condom use and linking, you know, HIV transmission to unsafe sex. You know, half of these, again, statistics I was looking at today, half of the HIV cases that are documented in Iran come from unsafe use of drugs. So essentially, you know, needle exchange programs. So, you know, just from a technical solution problem, the, you know, public health apparatus in Iran, which has a lot of, it has a lot of respect in the country because this was the apparatus which helped bring down the birth rate, for example, in the 1990s. You know, reduce, was able to convince a bunch of clerics that family planning and birth control is okay, right? And we're able to come up with...
Which is not favored any longer, though.
Fair enough, but you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, even though, you know...
Khomeini wants to increase the population.
You're not going to get 6 kids in the countryside anymore. So, you know, nevertheless. So this discourse of family planning, birth control use, you know, it's not taboo. And in many ways, it can be seen as, you know, scientific regulation of these populations, which otherwise has to have almost no connection to the state. How much resources do the state spend on it? I mean, they claim to spend a lot. They also recently just got donations from the Japanese and German government specifically to deal with drug interdiction. Why? Because where do all these drugs end up when they pass through Iran? They pass through Iran, go to Europe. So the Europeans have an interest in giving the Islamic Republic of Iran money to police the borders. And you know, about 3,000 police died last year in Iran on the borders, you know, interdicting drugs. And there's big borders with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Azerbaijan, the Turkish border. They're huge borders, and not really well policed. So, you know, a lot of resources are being poured into the country from outside from inside. The question is, even if you had, let's say they had double the budget in BSSD, what would they do with it? I mean, you know, what are the kind of policies that would lower the addiction rate? Because again, we can take a look at this country. There's a documentary that just came out in the United States called The Trade on Showtime by a director who's filmed in Syria, filmed in Mexico. It's about the heroin trade in the United States. It follows the heroin trade all the way back to Mexico. And the same, I mean, they're very similar scenes. Working class individuals, educated, sores on their mouth, their hands and feet are cracked from injections, happening in cities like, Columbus, Ohio, Flint, Michigan, you name it. So it's actually interesting to watch these two documentaries in tandem, because a lot of the problems are the same. Not all the problems, but there are some similar challenges. And I don't think the United States is dealing with the problem. It seems to be in a productive way.
No, we have a raging epidemic of opioid addiction here, and we don't know what to do about it, and we're not funding it properly.
About the safety of these women and what could happen to them, I also think that I really doubt that if the authorities are going to go after them, they are too busy with women who are opposing them and many other things that the women who are, especially the recent movement of women against the compulsory hijab, they are more now keen on arresting them, preventing them from repeating each other's action. And so I don't think it's a big deal for them. They may go after the filmmaker, some of them. It's enough just for a cleric could hear about this film or see it and makes a big, why Islam, what happened, why you're showing these things. Then they may call the director and question him and things like that. But there are too many more problems they are concerned about these days.
I'm just curious because I went to school in Iran.
Wait, say it louder.
Can you speak up,
sorry.
please?
So I went to school in Iran up until age 9, and I remember the quality of education being extremely high. So compared to the 70s, how would you compare the quality of K through 12 education now?
So she's asking how to compare the quality of education back in the 70s to today, because it was quite high when you were going to school there.
Well, it's been democratized in the sense that access to primary education had spread. I mean, it started in the Pahlavi period, and then it continued after the revolution. And I mean, basically, youth female literacy in Iran is 98%, and it wasn't at the time of the revolution. So that is, whatever process was going on before 79 had continued in terms of access to it. The problem is, and of course, I don't know. We can debate the quality of primary school education. In higher education, of course, they have the massive expansion of higher education in Iran. So you have your elite schools, the graduates of which some of are here in the audience. And then, of course, the massive expansion of private higher education systems. Every town in Iran has a small university or correspondence school. Anybody can get a credential, a piece of paper now. Sometimes some father's not going to let their daughter go to Tehran, big dangerous Tehran with all these doors. Instead, but going to the provincial town 30 minutes away, okay, the father knows where the daughter is, right? So the expansion of education has allowed women to leave the household or, gives them a space for leaving. However, the quality of this huge educational expansion in Iran is questionable, and what these pieces of paper are going to get you, not just on the labor market, which is a large issue for Iran and also other parts of the Middle East. You have very high educational attainment now for Iranian women, very low labor market participation. Labor market participation in Iran for women has not changed in about 15 years. So you have lots of really educated housewives, So there's a quality issue in the educational expansion. Well, it's a complex issue, right? It would be easy to say it's just the government or just society, but we can look at lots of other countries and see a lot of variation. So the main people who work on this subject are economists who run big labor market surveys and try to figure out the different pathways that women get employed in different countries, like Egypt, like in Syria before the war, like in Saudi. You know, a lot of Iran and Saudi have a lot of similar problems in this regard. And then what are the different ways that these pathways are blocked? It's not always the state. Sometimes it's male employers. Sometimes it's husbands. Sometimes it's just the labor market itself and the ways that skills are rewarded. So it's a bit complex. I don't want to go into it. But there's no simple answer, for better or for worse, on all the different pressures that tend to keep women out of the labor market. And when they enter the labor market, as Nayereh said, it takes a lot longer for them to find a job. And that is why unemployment rates are about double for women who are looking for a job. But still, the vast majority of women in Iran are not looking for a job. They are out of the labor force.
Can I add something? I'm a little more pessimistic than you about the quality. Well, you're emphasizing the quantity of the increase of education and literacy, which is fine. I mean, we should consider that, and that's the good news. But the quality overall, we can say, has not corresponded the quantity. And the education has become very commercialized. It has become, some people are even talking about like educated white proletariat, because they are just having degree with no jobs and running and driving taxis. Even men, let alone women. And also, especially higher education and secondary and primary education have been tried to be what they call Islamicized, Islamization of education, right? And that has failed. A lot of resources, money, efforts, a lot of expelling of professors, students, teachers from schools to make education Islamic, so to speak. And not only intellectuals are saying this. Just last week, President Rouhani announced that all these efforts were waste because Islamization has failed. It has been counterproductive. It has resulted in brain drain. Many of us are here because we don't get the education we want that is relevant to the needs of society. Many of the things that we learn, especially the old traditional way of rudimentary, memorizing.
It's a rote instruction.
Right. So people learn a lot of information. Critical thinking is very minimal and discouraged. Especially if teachers are teaching in a critical thinking to students, then they are alarmed, and those teachers are dangerous. So, especially the point that Islamization of education has failed, now it has been recognized at least by even president of Iranian country, which to me, it was a lot of courage. It took a lot of courage for him to say that.
For any leader, really.
For any leader, right.
Our own here, President Guilan.
Actually, my question ties back into what Dr. Tohidi mentioned earlier about the Iranian government not really caring much about, improving the welfare situation of these women. So my question is basically, who then is the intended audience for this bill? If no one's going to, care about it inside Iran, because honestly, I can see it kind of fitting directly into the course syllabi on women in the Middle East, like social issues, like how victimized women are, and things like that. So what is the intended audience, in your opinion, for this film, and what is the impact? Who sees this, and what happens?
Did everyone hear the question? The question was on the intended audience of this.
And about the government not caring. When I speak about government, in Iran, political system is, so complicated, so fractionized, right? So there are members of government who care, who try to improve things. When Shahindeh Molaverdi was responsible for women's affairs, she really tried, and she did some good things. And she's still trying. Recently, as now she has a different position, but about the civil rights. She's monitoring civil rights of people, and she produced an educational project against sexual harassment. So there are people who are trying. It's not that it's a, homogeneous, everybody is evil, whoever is part of the political system. But we have at least two, parallel forces that are ruling in Iran. One is mostly a semi-elected body, but given the election, the problems that we have election, but nevertheless they are sort of elected, and then the body of the kind of the deepest state, that is Ayatollah Khamenei himself and the Sepah, the Revolutionary Guards, and other entities who are not elected. So that's why you can talk like very specifically about the whole regime or whole government when it comes to these policy issues. So this film, I think, is made by people from civil society, not necessarily government, but they had the cooperation of governmental elements, otherwise they couldn't make this film.
Really? They couldn't shoot it underground? I mean, it was mostly indoors.
But they have to show it somewhere. It's not a secret film.
Right. But it doesn't
make
have
it,
it doesn't have the
sure.
censor's approval yet, right?
Esha has some information to help us with that.
Oh.
I don't, or Amir may know exactly how this film was made and who helped, but at the end of the film, they thank even some government offices for collaboration. If you look at the credits part of the film, they are acknowledging the cooperation they received from even Nayereh Tohidi, for example.
We'll let Amir respond. Yeah.
Hello everyone. Because we shared DP in this film, the DP in this film.
Wait, louder.
Your mic is not working.
No, hold it closer.
Okay. We use the same cameraman. Low that. Okay. Anyway, so
so you use the same cameraman in your film as this cameraman. Okay.
First of all, this film was made with governmental collaboration because the institute that we're shooting was something belonged to government. So they basically needed the permission, and for filming anywhere in Iran, you need the permission from the police department. So basically, they will know that you are shooting.
And Amir, what is the documentary culture there? Are there theaters where, independent films could be shown? Would this be shown only in art houses or art groups, or will it be broadcast?
We have a big documentary society in Iran, and it's dated very late in the late 60s, the rise of modern documentary in Iran. And you may know one of the first documentaries ever, The Grass, 1908, was made in Iran, by a German filmmaker. And we had a very big movement in the late 60s in Iran. So now we have a limited screening for documentaries in a specific screening group called The Art and the Experience. There are limited screening times, but they are screening it for a long time, for like a 6 months screening.
Like a cinematheque sort of theater.
Kind of, but not in a specific theater, but in all the theaters. And we have a documentary channel dedicated to social documentaries, and
that's government run.
Yeah, but it's interesting. It's interesting that censorship codes is different for that TV channel with other channels. Like in TV in general, Iranian TV doesn't are not allowed to show musical instrument, but you can show musical instrument in the documentary channel. So yeah, and in terms of the release forms, we don't have any release form in Iran, so we can basically shoot everyone.
And will these women, could they get in trouble if this film is shown publicly? Would they be persecuted?
Because Ladan that you watched in the film, the last lady, she was nominated for Best Actress in this year Iranian Film Festival. Yeah, she was. Not for this film. She used to be an actress many years ago, and the director of the Guilan Siassi, the director of the Small Rusted Brains, which was the phenomenon film this year film festival, cast her for his new film, and she was nominated for Best Supporting Actress. So somehow I don't think it could be any trouble for any of them.
Interesting.
And I wanted to add something about the Iranian female filmmakers, because I'm curating a conference for next year for Iranian filmmakers. I did a little research. We had a good percentage of Iranian filmmakers. Like last year, we had 25% of. Last year, box office in Iran was belonging to Iranian female filmmakers, which in Hollywood was 7%. And we have some industries, film industries in Iran, like animation, which are women dominant. Like we have, because I work in animation, I can tell like 80%, 70% of women animation directors are females.
So the majority of women filmmakers in animation are women. I'd like to know if they're paid as the same as men.
Yeah,
they do. Yeah.
And also in documentary, we have a lot of women filmmakers. And also, I wanted to add an interesting thing that Nilüfer just showed me, that the officials announced about the percentage of Iranian women addicts. Like they said, there's 2,800,000 addicts in Iran, and which 10% of them are women. So this was released yesterday, so I think it can be useful for discussion.
I just have a comment. I think my voice isn't loud enough. So I think to me it makes sense that state-supported project is not. It's working.
Is it working? Yes. And hi, my name is Esha. So I think, to me, it makes sense that the state would support a project like this, because it totally erased this role of state in the life of these people and put it merely on individuals. Like in one case, it's the family; the other one is, So I think, and gender oppression. But I think with the name of the film and the subjects that the filmmaker chose, is trying to tell us what really is the problem, which is gender oppression, which is the criminalization of these women with, or I think like 2 or 3 of them were, they were disabled. They were, so with choosing this subject, is trying to tell us, and with the name femininity, but it's I think they choose to not criticize the state, to be able to get their support and make something like this. But with what they show, like there were 2 transgenders, and we see like that it was not their choices, it wasn't their personal choices. So while they are saying that this was an individual choice or individual circumstance, the family didn't support, the family had addiction, but it's showing, the personas. One is a disabled person, 2 transgenders, and so I think it makes sense that they support a project. And even in our discussions, we totally, dismissed the role of the state in the lives of these women, and connected it to a more an international, which like, the opioid addiction here, and that's a perfect result for Islamic, state of Iran. So.
And of course, things are just as bad abroad, as we learned from the daughter of that character. That
exactly, that was another thing.
The heaven abroad.
Is also.
She was so disillusioned to hear that she thought, going abroad would solve all the problems, and in fact, it's just as bad, possibly even worse.
Well, I think, do we have time, or should we wrap up? How we?
One more.
Way in the back.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about like the issues of Orientalism and self-Orientalism. I mean, as you said, this shows a very small segment of Iranian society, after Iranian society, and as you said, this is sort of a new genre, or this kind of, social issue genre, perhaps, in documentaries. So, and going off with what you said about like intended audience, I was thinking like, thinking about what these producers have in their mind when they're, producing this kind of films. Do you think? I mean, can they think about us watching this here in Los Angeles and this? Because I'm not sure if like I grew up in Iran. I barely watched documentaries in theaters, and I did a master's in basically documentary filmmaking in Sweden. I went back to Iran, and still. So I was thinking about, what kind of audiences do you think this film?
It's the same question we documentary filmmakers ask in America too, but obviously different application. I mean, I don't know. Amir spoke to sort of a sort of Cinematech-esque program that could rotate through cinemas.
I want to relate it to like the projects or ideology or sort of the gaze or Orientalist or self-Orientalist gaze.
Yeah, about Orientalism. I think even in America, in many countries, the number of people who watch documentaries are usually intellectuals, highly educated people. So this film is not made for public Americans. So that's why I wouldn't consider that an Orientalist film. There are lots of documentaries made in America about social ills and social problems, right? So why can't Iranians also talk about their social problems? And why should we always be so defensive about showing and uncovering our problems? I think that attitude, I'm not saying you are necessarily holding to that, but I'm saying this worry and concern is kind of an overreaction to some Orientalism in the past, like the movie Not Without My Daughter. I would say that is an Orientalist film that tries to trash the whole Iranian culture by that film. But showing or making documentaries about social ills, which is not unique to Iran, as we discussed. None of these cases were unique to Iran. But at the same time, as Aisha said, at least I didn't dismiss or ignore the role of state here. And I started saying that this is especially embarrassing for a state that has claimed, have created or has been promising to create a utopian puritanic society free from corruption, free from addiction, from prostitution, from all those things that they have moralized, right? So, but when we see that even condom is being said that should be reused because it is expensive, you have to wash it and reuse it again. Remember that scene about condom? So it shows how
there are lots of male condoms.
Well, yeah, but they are not willing to use. So the problem is that it shows how limited their resources, their budget given to these places are, that they are even worried about reuse of condom. That tells a lot about the priorities that this state has. They are spending incredible amount of money interfering in other countries' affairs. Billions of dollars, right? Goes to Syria, goes to Lebanon, goes to Yemen, and billions of money is spent on monitoring women's hijab, all sorts of mechanisms to control women's body and women's appearance. Billions of money to propaganda for all these things, but not enough money for schools. Schools are worn out. Many schools in especially provinces, go look at their status of their, the conditions of schools. And places like this, what kind of welfares they are providing for the most susceptible, most vulnerable segments of society. Look at the rates of unemployment. So these are all, unemployment creates a lot of poverty, and poverty creates violence, and violence and abuse creates children of street women on the streets. and a vicious cycle. So of course the state is playing a role here. But as Isha said, they were very careful, the producer and the director, not to deal with politics. But we can see it indirectly, the role of the state.
Do you have any?
Well, I just want to back to the point of who's the audience. So we should actually give credit to filmmakers. Even in the 1960s and 70s, there was also a genre of social realism, of social problems. Many films made in the 70s only were really shown in the late 70s when there was a bit of an opening, and many of those films actually had very similar critiques as Nayereh just made against the existing state. That the state is the source of all the problems, and the problems you see in a metropolitan society, cities of, well, Tehran at the time was smaller, but still a huge metropolis. Now it's 12 to 16 million people. This is politicized by a civil society. And who watches this film? Intellectuals, fair enough. But people who, intellectuals have connections in Iran too. Uncle's an MP, so people make demands. And because there is a fragmentation in the political elite in Iran, there are constituencies who can be lobbied. And it has changed, I'm sorry to say, but that has changed social policy in the past in Iran. So this is not falling on deaf ears, that this is there are avenues to make claims on the state, whether it's in rural social policy. Look, I've been to village clinics all around Iran, and in every clinic there's a medicine cabinet, there's a woman behfaz, and there's a box of condoms. And that's not display for me, that's there because they not only make it feel good, they ram it down people's throats, or they used to, in the countryside. So, the conversation of birth control and sexual regulation, family planning is not taboo. It's discussed in the newspaper, on TV and television. People have opinions about it. Everybody has an opinion about it in Iran. So I think that, and these films can play a role when elements of society decide to use them and make demands and utilize the exact same language, by the way, that Nayereh just said, which is, shaming the state. I don't think anybody thinks the utopia is still on the horizon, but the fact of a revolutionary society, revolutions come with promises, right? French, Russian, Iranian come with promises. The promises never materialize, but the ideal which was held out at the time is used as a battering ram against the government, rightly so, and the kind of failures, again, it's not just the reformists or people like us, middle-class people. Right-wing politicians in Iran use this all the time to shame the state or to shame someone else in society. So we can't just say that it's only the good guys who critique the state. In fact, it's a bit more complex. Conservative intellectuals in Iran constantly use the discourse of morality, behavior, to also make claims. And sometimes that actually ends up, by the way, in increased budgets for social policy. I wish it was so simple as just reformist intellectuals once in a while get a win and everybody else is bad, but it's a bit more complex. Especially, in a place like southern Tehran, what reformist politician has been down there? No offense, but who's going down there to interact with this part of Tehran? One of the great critiques of the reformist movement was that they were so disconnected from the actually lived existence of Iranians down there. I'm not surprised that a guy like Ahmadinejad, who, like him or love him, but he's popular with some groups in Iranian society, because he spoke to these kind of issues and other politicians.
Mr. Trump, he speaks a lot.
Fair enough.
What does he do in practice?
I'm supposed to wrap up this panel, but I would just like to tie your final comment back to the question about self-orientalism and Orientalism in general, because precisely what we as a Western audience have been seeing since at least the Green Revolution, the most visible side has been the elites who have been protesting the state. That's the narrative we like to hear. And so what's really interesting about this film is, and you see even in the way they dress, they look like some of these, the colorful hijab, the tight hijab, the barely hijab that we see in the media that's sort of making revolt against the Islamic Republic sexy in the West for Western audiences. We're seeing the underbelly of that. So I thought that was really interesting in the film. And I will if everyone agrees, I will I will wrap up, and I will thank all of you. Thank you so much to Amir and Nilufar and all of PACSA, and to our wonderful discussants,
We should
and
get together
Lisa,
sometime.
and all of you for coming.
Thank you.